For decades, Catherine O'Hara made audiences laugh without ever asking for attention. And now, as reports about her passing circulate, people around the world are revisiting why her presence mattered so much in the first place. Not because of a single role, not because of awards, but because of a rare kind of comedic intelligence that quietly shaped modern comedy. And the most surprising part? Her greatest impact didn't come early in her career. It came much later, when most performers are already fading from the spotlight. According to publicly reported information, news outlets began sharing reports that Catherine O'Hara had passed away at the age of 71, with limited details initially available. As with many developing stories involving public figures, information unfolded cautiously, prompting both reflection and appreciation rather than speculation. Almost immediately, social media filled with clips, not dramatic moments, not viral controversies, but quiet scenes of comedic brilliance, a single line delivery, a pause, a facial expression held just a second too long. Because Catherine O'Hara's influence was never loud, it was precise. And to understand why her work resonated across generations, you have to go back to a time before fame, before films, before awards, when she almost wasn't cast at all. Born in Toronto in 1954, Catherine O'Hara didn't grow up surrounded by show business glamour. Her early exposure to performance was modest, including a childhood role in a nativity play, and her path into comedy was anything but guaranteed. After high school, she wasn't cast as a star. She wasn't scouted. She wasn't discovered. She worked as a waitress, specifically at Toronto's Second City Theatre, a place that would later become synonymous with comedic legends. What made this moment unusual wasn't her ambition. It was her patience. She watched. She learned. She absorbed timing, rhythm, and restraint, traits that would later define her career. When she finally auditioned, the feedback wasn't encouraging. By her own later recollection, she was advised, or her, politely but clearly, to stick to waitressing. Most people would have taken that as a sign. She didn't. When Catherine O'Hara eventually joined Second City in the mid-1970s, she entered an environment filled with big personalities and bold comedic styles. But she didn't compete by being louder. She competed by being smarter. In interviews years later, she explained that early on, stage fear pushed her toward an unexpected technique. When unsure, she leaned into characters that were unpredictable, emotionally exaggerated, or slightly unhinged, not for shock, but for freedom. Because those characters didn't need to explain themselves, that instinct would later become her signature. And it's the same instinct that carried her into SCTV, a sketch show that didn't just parody celebrities. It studied them. Her impressions weren't cruel. They weren't flashy. They were accurate enough to be uncomfortable. And that's why they worked. Despite SCTV's creative success and critical recognition, the reality behind the scenes was far less stable. The show came and went. Network deals shifted. Paychecks weren't consistent. At one point, she was invited to join Saturday Night Live, a career-defining opportunity by any standard. She said yes. Then circumstances changed. SCTV was picked up again, and she chose to return, a decision that, at the time, confused many observers and later created a reputation she didn't fully agree with. Some believed she didn't want to work. Her explanation was far simpler and far more revealing. She trusted her instincts. If a project didn't feel right, she walked away, not out of fear, out of respect for the work and for the audience. Her move into film wasn't explosive. There was no overnight stardom. Instead, she appeared consistently in projects that valued subtlety. By the mid-1980s, her roles in films like After Hours and Heartburn showed something rare, a comedian who understood tone as deeply as timing. Then came Beetlejuice. As Delia Dietz, she delivered a performance that was theatrical without being exaggerated, a balance that would later define many of her most beloved roles. And this was only the beginning, because the role that would permanently place her in popular culture came from a film that looked simple on the surface and timeless underneath. When Home Alone premiered in 1990, audiences focused on the child at the center of the story. But years later, many realized something else. The emotional weight of that film didn't come from chaos. It came from care. Catherine O'Hara's portrayal of a mother wasn't exaggerated or sentimental. It was grounded, sincere, and quietly urgent. It made the story work, and without trying to steal scenes, she became unforgettable. Yet even with iconic roles accumulating, her career still had one more chapter, one that would redefine how audiences saw her entirely. And it didn't happen until decades later. By the mid-1990s, Catherine O'Hara had already built a respected career. But something quietly shifted when she began collaborating with filmmaker Christopher Guest. These weren't traditional comedies. They didn't rely on punchlines, they didn't explain the joke, and they trusted the audience completely. In Waiting for Guffman, Best in Show, and later A Mighty Wind, O'Hara worked almost entirely without a fixed script. Scenes were shaped through improvisation, listening, and restraint. This environment suited her perfectly. She didn't chase laughs, she earned them, often by saying very little. Critics later described her performances as bittersweet, layered, and deeply human. She wasn't playing caricatures, she was playing people who took themselves seriously, which made everything funnier. And one partnership in particular became central to this phase of her career. Catherine O'Hara and Eugene Levy didn't just act together, they shared a rhythm. Having worked side by side since their Second City days, they developed what many later described as a kind of creative shorthand, a mutual understanding of timing, vulnerability, and comedic understatement. They weren't afraid of silence, they weren't afraid of awkwardness, and they trusted each other completely. Over the years, they portrayed couples, collaborators, and emotional opposites, always grounded, never exaggerated for effect. So when the opportunity came decades later to work together again on a new television project, the foundation was already there. What no one could have predicted was how much that project would change everything. When Schitt's Creek premiered in 2015, it wasn't an immediate phenomenon. It aired quietly in Canada and on a smaller U.S. network. There was no massive marketing push, no viral moment. But the show had something rare. It respected its characters. Catherine O'Hara's role as Moira Rose wasn't designed to be instantly likable. Her voice, her fashion, her emotional detachment, all of it was intentional and risky, because Moira could have easily become a one-note joke. She didn't. Instead, O'Hara infused her with dignity, insecurity, and unexpected warmth. Often hidden beneath dramatic language and elaborate wigs. And those wigs, they weren't just visual comedy. According to O'Hara herself, they were emotional markers, reflections of how the character felt on any given day. That level of thought transformed Moira into something far deeper than a comedic exaggeration. The turning point didn't come during the show's first season, or its second. It came later, when Schitt's Creek arrived on streaming platforms and found an entirely new audience. Suddenly, viewers weren't watching one episode a week. They were watching everything. And Moira Rose became iconic. Not because of volume, but because of precision. Clips circulated not as jokes, but as moments. A glance, a pause, a line delivered just off-center. Catherine O'Hara wasn't playing for applause. She was playing for truth. However unusual that truth appeared on the surface, when award season arrived, it didn't feel like a comeback. It felt like a correction. In 2020, Catherine O'Hara received the Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series, along with a Golden Globe and a Screen Actors Guild Award. In her acceptance speech, she didn't focus on validation. She focused on gratitude, grateful to play a woman of her age, grateful to be fully herself on screen, grateful to collaborate with people she trusted. There was no bitterness about earlier years, no sense of being overlooked, just appreciation. And that reaction revealed something important about her entire career. Looking back across decades of work, a pattern becomes clear. Catherine O'Hara didn't chase exposure. She chased quality. In interviews, she often explained that she chose projects based on a simple question. Would she be proud to be part of this? If the answer was no, she declined, even when the opportunity seemed significant. That philosophy meant fewer roles, longer gaps, less noise, but it also meant consistency in tone, integrity, and craft. And that consistency is why her work aged so well. While comedy defined much of her public image, her range extended far beyond it. She lent her voice to animated films, bringing warmth and nuance to characters that might otherwise have felt simple. She appeared in dramatic television roles that earned critical recognition, including an Emmy nomination for Temple Grandin. Even later in her career, she continued exploring new formats and genres, selecting roles that allowed her to observe rather than dominate. She didn't need to be the loudest presence on screen. She knew when to step back, and that restraint became part of her signature. Despite decades in the public eye, Catherine O'Hara maintained clear boundaries around her personal life. She married production designer Bo Welch in the early 1990s, and together they raised 2 sons. When asked about marriage, her answers were never idealized. They were practical, humorous, grounded. Communication, she once said, often came through humor, a way of easing tension rather than escalating it. That balance between openness and privacy mirrored her career choices, present but never overexposed. As reports of her passing circulated, the response wasn't driven by shock. It was driven by reflection. People weren't sharing headlines. They were sharing scenes, lines, expressions, moments that still worked years later. And that raises an important question. What does it mean to leave behind work that doesn't age out of relevance? Catherine O'Hara never tried to define a generation. She simply stayed consistent, and the generations came to her. From sketch comedy to film, from voice acting to long-form television, her work shared a common thread: respect for the audience. She trusted viewers to notice the small things, the pauses, the restraint, the intention behind every choice. That's why her performances don't feel tied to a specific decade. They still work, they still land, and they still feel surprisingly modern. Many performers peak early, some peak loudly, others burn out just as fast. Catherine O'Hara followed a different path. Her most celebrated role arrived decades into her career, not as a reinvention, but as a refinement. Everything she had learned before was already there. It just finally had the right frame. That's not common, and it's why her career is often studied, not just admired. She proved that patience isn't a weakness in entertainment. It's leverage. One reason audiences responded so strongly to her work is because it never talked down to them. Her characters were flawed, but not mocked, unusual, but never reduced, funny, and without being cruel. Even at her most exaggerated, there was empathy underneath. And empathy is what lasts. That's why people don't quote her lines just to laugh. They quote them because they remember how those moments felt. Looking back, one theme appears again and again. Catherine O'Hara chose her work deliberately. She stepped away when something didn't feel right. She waited when the timing wasn't there. She returned when the project aligned with her values. That approach doesn't always lead to fast success, but it leads to durable success. And durability is what allowed her work to remain relevant well into the streaming era, when entirely new audiences discovered her for the first time. As with many public figures, the initial headlines focused on the news itself, but what followed was more telling. People didn't just acknowledge her career, they revisited it. They rewatched episodes, they shared scenes, they introduced her work to younger viewers. That kind of response doesn't come from hype, it comes from trust. Catherine O'Hara's story isn't just about comedy. It's about longevity without compromise, about creativity without urgency, about choosing quality over visibility, and being remembered for it. Her work remains not because it demanded attention, but because it earned it. And as audiences continue to revisit what she left behind, one thing becomes clear. Some performers leave moments, others leave methods. She left a way of working that still quietly influences comedy today.